curious, engaging, it is easy to look back at history and point out what went wrong. We know the outcomes, and we have the luxury of hindsight. Imagine bringing a modern leader back to the mid-20th century, armed with contemporary data and confident criticisms of past decisions. Now, place them directly across the desk from the historical leader who actually had to build the foundation of the state. Let's run a stress test. What happens if we take today's political confidence and force it to solve the actual physical constraints of the 1950s? Take the modern critique of 1962. Why engage in diplomacy with an unpredictable neighbor instead of immediately building a heavy military presence? Look at the realities on the ground. These soldiers are marching into freezing, high-altitude terrain without specialized winter gear or modern automatic weapons. The obvious modern solution is to increase the defense budget. But after 2 centuries of colonial rule, the national treasury was completely empty. When you cannot afford to equip a modern army, diplomacy becomes a mathematical necessity. It is the only viable survival strategy to delay a conflict you cannot afford to fight. Why take the Kashmir dispute to the UN? Why not let the military push forward across this vast hostile geography and finish the conflict? While the military was engaged on the border, the interior of the country was actively collapsing under the weight of partition. State logistics were completely overwhelmed by sectarian violence, mass starvation, and the sudden displacement of millions of refugees. Fighting a high-altitude war while the mainland burns requires supply lines that simply did not exist. Bringing the dispute here to the international community was an attempt to pause the bleeding. Agreeing to a ceasefire was a desperate triage measure. The immediate priority was preventing a deeply fractured, newly born nation from imploding entirely. Then there is the question of global alliances. A modern observer might ask why the country refused to align with either the US or the USSR to secure rapid economic and military aid. This diagram illustrates the geopolitical gravity of the Cold War. Accepting superpower money meant becoming a proxy state, sacrificing the independence the nation spent decades fighting to secure. Domestically, critics point to the slow reliance on the public sector instead of fostering private industry growth. The reality of post-colonial India was a complete absence of private capital. There were absolutely no domestic investors with the wealth required to build foundational infrastructure. To build massive heavy industries like this steel plant from scratch, the state was the only entity with the capacity to execute the work. Non-alignment and state-driven industry were non-negotiable survival mechanisms for a government starting with zero geopolitical leverage and a bankrupt economy. Imagine trying to manage an active border conflict, a collapsing interior, zero domestic wealth, and aggressive Cold War superpowers, all at the same time. Debating policy on a screen decades later removes the crushing real-time pressure of making those decisions. History is lived forward into the unknown. We judge it backward with perfect clarity. Building a nation out of the ashes of an empire requires a distinct kind of endurance, just as leading a modern powerhouse requires its own vision. True historical literacy requires abandoning simple judgments. It demands an understanding of the severe physical constraints that force leaders to make the difficult choices we now read about in textbooks.